Hello everyone, today I will be servicing a Konica Hexanon AR 28mm f1.8 UC type lens. This lens has a very stiff iris and focus ring, oily and sticky iris blades, and some haze in the front group. I will be fully disassembling the lens to clean it up, regrease the focusing helicoid, clean the iris blades, and remove any dust and marks from the optics. The first thing I did was to inspect and run technical tests on the lens. I found the lens to be very sharp, as expected, with no signs of decentering, but it still needed servicing for mechanical issues. I started by unscrewing the name ring from the front of the lens using the appropriate rubber tool, then continued slowly by hand for better control, avoiding any damage to the front element. Next, I carefully removed the rubber band from the focusing ring with a wooden tool, being careful not to stretch it too much, exposing the two separate parts of the ring. While holding the lens with a firm grip, but not too tight to avoid bending the mechanics, I unscrewed the top part of the focusing ring. Now we can see the metal fork responsible for transmitting the focusing movement from the focusing ring to the secondary helicoid, which is part of the floating element design. The back group moves back and forth at a different ratio than the front group. This design is similar to lenses like Zeiss Contax 28mm f2 and 35mm f1.4. Next, I applied some acetone to the small set screw on the side of the front frame. After carefully removing the screw, I was able to unscrew the front frame. With a firm grip, I removed the top element. I mark where the fork sits when the lens is at infinity and close focus, just to be safe, and I also mark the position of the secondary helicoid when at infinity. Then I removed the rest of the front group and gave it a quick inspection, noticing some haze and dirt that I will clean later. At this point, I used my caliper to measure the distance of the secondary helicoid at infinity. It's not strictly necessary, but it helps ensure the helicoid is reassembled at the correct distance. I also mark where the fork sits, since it's adjustable. Next, I remove the metal fork, which is connected to the secondary helicoid by one large screw in the middle and two smaller screws at its legs. Once the fork was removed, I could freely remove the secondary helicoid. But before doing so, I moved to the back of the lens, starting by removing the mount, the locking mechanism, the plate that connects the iris ring to the aperture mechanism, the stop screw next to it, and the two screws and spring responsible for the clicking operation. I then unscrewed the iris ring, marking where it came off, and carefully stored the clicking bolts before giving everything a quick clean. I then returned to the front and removed the three screws that tighten the focus ring onto the helicoid and the focusing ring. I made a couple of marks on the main helicoid and measured the distance with my caliper when the lens was at infinity. This was also a good time to remove the back group. It's always a priority to minimize the time spent working around the elements to reduce the risk of accidents. The back group was clean inside with only a few dust particles on the element in front of the iris. I slowly started removing the secondary helicoid, marking the exit point. This helicoid has two threads, so my mark was at the point where the top thread unlocked. This provided enough information to reassemble the helicoid correctly. It took a bit of wiggling to get the bottom thread to engage, allowing me to continue unscrewing. Now I unscrew the retaining ring that holds the aperture mechanism and middle group in place. I remove the middle group from the aperture mechanism, giving it a quick inspection and noticing some cleaning marks. The aperture mechanism was now free, and with a small tap I removed it. Since it was very oily, I gave it a quick clean with lighter fluid, which also explained the oil on the blades. I made a small mark to indicate the orientation of the helicoid keys and removed them. Next, I slowly unscrewed the inner helicoid, paying attention to where it decoupled and marking the exit point. I repeated this process with the outer helicoid. With the lens now fully disassembled, I proceeded with cleaning. After wiping off most of the grease, I began cleaning by placing all the helicoid parts and the iris ring into my ultrasonic cleaner filled with lighter fluid. This resulted in very clean parts, as if they just came from the factory. I also used some acetone to remove any remaining thread lock and glue. Once everything was dry and clean, I started reassembly. I applied a thin layer of number 10 helical grease to just one part of the outer helicoid because I didn't want the focusing to feel too heavy. After assembling the outer helicoid, I double-checked that the fill was light and smooth with no gaps between the parts. I measured the distance with my caliper to ensure the helicoid was sitting correctly. I then applied grease to one side of the inner helicoid and inserted it in the position I had marked during this assembly. Again, I tested for gaps and measured with my caliper to confirm proper assembly. I applied some grease to the area where the helicoid keys would slide and positioned them correctly. After screwing them in, I tested the focus fill one last time to ensure there were no gaps in the helicoid. Since the lens has a secondary helicoid that would add weight to the focusing, it's important to get a very light focusing fill at this stage. Next, it's time to clean the iris blades. I start by making the necessary marks to indicate the correct orientation of the iris. Then I remove the large spring on the back of the mechanism. Now the iris can move freely without snapping back closed. I carefully remove the 3 set screws on the side, which allows me to remove the blade assembly from the rest of the mechanism. I make another small mark on the side as an additional reference point for the correct orientation. After that, I remove the 3 screws securing the top plate of the assembly, making sure to store away the 3 spacers that keep the plate at the correct distance from the blade. I also remove the back plate, which makes removing the blades much easier. As you can see, the whole assembly is quite oily, which is why you can just clean the blades without disassembling the entire mechanism. If the blades are oily, the rest of the mechanism will be oily as well, so it needs full disassembly for proper cleaning. I proceed to clean each part, including the blades, using lighter fluid. I take my time to ensure everything is completely clean and dry with no oil left anywhere in the mechanism. I decided to use my ultrasonic cleaner for the mechanism part to ensure all traces of oil are removed. Once everything is clean and dry, I can begin the reassembly. I start by reinstalling the back plate of the assembly, then slowly inserting each blade, making sure they are clean. I use a Q-tip with a tiny amount of lighter fluid to clean any marks or dust on the blades. The last blade is always the hardest as it needs to go under the first one. This requires patience, so I take my time. Once all the blades are in place, I test the mechanism to ensure everything is functioning smoothly and the blades are clean. Finally, I reinstall the spacers and the front plate in the correct orientation. I don't use thread lock on any of these screws as it can evaporate and contaminate the mechanism and blades with oil again. I add a bit of grease at the point where the assembly connects to the mechanism, and after inserting the small pin into the assembly, I carefully place it back into the mechanism. I carefully align the assembly to the correct position and insert the 3 set screws on the side. After that, I clean the spring and reapply a little grease to both the mechanism and the spring before reinstalling it. Once everything is in place and functioning correctly, I apply some UV glue to the screws holding the spring. The aperture mechanism and blades are now clean and ready to be reinserted into the lens. Everything needs to be aligned properly for it to fit together, including a large side screw and the connection with the iris pin on the lens. Next, I turn my attention to the middle element. Due to its coating type, this specific element is very difficult to clean once it becomes wet. So in this case, I use a dry Q-tip and carefully remove any marks and dust from the element. Keep in mind, I work in a relative humid environment, which makes using a dry Q-tip possible. If you're working in an environment with humidity below 45%, this method might not be ideal. I use a rubber tool to carefully insert the element back into the lens, then tighten it in place. I apply some UV glue to the screws of the helicoid keys. This helps absorb any strong forces applied to the helicoid, especially when using focusing motors for filmmaking. I then apply grease and reinstall the iris ring along with the locking mechanism, the aperture control plate and the stop screw. Finally, I put the clicking bolts and springs back in place along with the small set screws that hold them and adjust the tension for the clicking. Once everything is working smoothly, I remove any dust from the back of the middle element and give the inner side of the back group a thorough cleaning. After cleaning, I reinsert it into the lens. I always check carefully after inserting each group to ensure there are no large dust particles or marks on the elements. Finally, I reinstalled the lens mount, applying thread lock to its screws. Next, I move back to the front of the lens. I apply a thin layer of grease to one part of the secondary helicoid, making sure it engages in the correct position, which I confirm using my caliper. I then clean the focusing ring and secure it with its 3 screws. After that, I reinstall the secondary helicoid control screw and fork, aligning them with the marks I made during this assembly. There is a slight gap when I turn the focusing ring, so I use a pair of pliers to carefully tighten the fork and eliminate the gap. Once everything feels good, I temporarily reassemble the rest of the front group to test the alignment and calibrate the infinity focus of the lens. I use a setup with a film camera with a plate on its film plane and a lens adjusted to project infinity onto that plate. This allows me to set accurate infinity from the comfort of my workstation. After that, I remove the front group again to address the haze. I remove each element and clean them as needed, including a few swipes with lighter fluid. My technique is to first use a larger amount of lighter fluid to clean any haze, followed by a second round with a smaller amount to remove any residue. I repeat this process until everything is perfectly clean. Afterward, I reassemble the front group, cleaning the elements as I go. I perform a final inspection to ensure the lens elements are as clean as possible without any significant haze or large dust particles. I proceed by applying UV glue to the focusing ring screws. Once everything is set and dry, I reinstall the front frame and secure it with its set screw, applying some UV glue to it as well. I then reattach the top part of the focusing ring and the focusing ring rubber. The client sent me a C-mode focus gear to install on the lens, so after taking measurements, I choose the appropriate rubber insert and carefully slide the focusing gear onto the focusing ring. On lenses like this, it's important to install any focus gear from the top side to avoid breaking the thread lock on the focusing ring screws. After confirming everything is working correctly, I reinstall the name ring. Now this lens is fully serviced and ready to be used for a long time with confidence and without any issues. Thank you so much for watching this video. Always remember, do not open up Videns lenses without the proper tools, patience and experience. Lenses servicing can be very stressful and traumatic to some extent if an expensive and rare lens gets permanently damaged. There are still many great technicians out there that can get your lens in perfect shape without all the stress and worries, so make sure to consider all the options. Have a great day and see you next time.